Hello and welcome. This video is about the Fujifilm 16-80 f4 zoom lens. I've owned this lens for about 2 years, taken it on a lot of different trips, had it in a lot of different weather conditions. So I thought it was time to take a moment and just review it and let you know everything I think about it. I think this will tell you pretty much everything you need to know if you're considering maybe buying it. So let's just get started. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how this lens performs. I bought this lens for both photos and video. Let's talk a little bit about photography first. It's really handy to have, and a 16-80 focal range is very useful on the Fujifilm crop sensor cameras. And honestly, I've taken a number of trips with it and gone places without it, and every time I leave home without it, I wish that I had it, because it's just so handy to have that much optionality in your focal range while you're shooting. So from that aspect, it's really great. In terms of the rendition, it's pretty sharp across the board, especially wide open into like the 55-60 millimeter range. You're going to be, I think, pretty happy with those results. As you get zoomed in, say like 70-80 millimeters, it loses a little bit of that sharpness. It's maybe not quite as crisp, but definitely perfectly usable. The thing about Fujifilm lenses is I think they design them in such a way that it really gives a very clinical rendition, and they're all very similar to each other. So if you own other Fujifilm lenses, like the f2 series, any of the newer lenses, you're not going to be surprised by this. It will look very similar to those lenses. And wide open, it isn't quite as good, but honestly, I shoot it at f4 a lot, and I've not been unhappy with it. If you really want a super tacky sharp image, then down to like 5.6 or even f8 is what I'll do if I don't actually need the shallow depth of field. But honestly, I don't think too much about that. For the most part, I just use the lens as I please, set it however I want, and that seems to work pretty well. I'm really never disappointed with how the images look afterwards. It's not, an art lens or anything like that, but I think if you're just looking for like good color, good sharpness, and the great images, it does that job. So it meets that need very well. The one major issue that I have is for video, and that is as you change the zoom, the focal range, and move the zoom, it loses focus. And so if you're wanting actual zooming as a part of your video, I don't do that very much. I tend to take more static shots. I don't zoom in and out and then use that footage. That's kind of a problem. It doesn't look very good. It's very distracting to see. So if you're doing that kind of video, I might recommend you look at a different option. When I originally bought this, I bought it because it has image stabilization, and I was shooting it on my X-T2, which doesn't have in-body stabilization. And I have to say, the stabilization on this lens is like really, really good. In fact, I can hear the little pieces that like hover in there when it's working. And honestly, using it on the X-T4, which has in-body image stabilization, it's a little better than without, but it's not a huge difference. And so if you don't happen to have a camera with IBIS, this is a great option, I think, and will work really well for you. The only thing I would say is it's pretty noisy if your audio is hooked up like on your camera. If you put a shotgun mic on the top of your camera and then use this lens with video, you will, I think, potentially get a little bit of feedback. I have, and you can kind of hear the lens whirring in there. Yeah. Especially if you zoom it all the way in, say like 80 millimeters, and then it's running the stabilization, it kind of makes a little bit of a humming sound, and for quiet parts of your video, you can hear that. So that could also be a deal breaker for some people. I don't tend to use audio a lot in my video. Most of my video is silent, and then I'm doing like voiceover or stuff like that. So not a huge problem for me. But again, maybe some better options out there if that's a need that you have specifically. As you bring it in, so as you bring the focus range wider, that tends to go away a little bit because the lens doesn't work as hard to stabilize the image, which is nice. The bokeh looks good. Nothing to really write home about or complain. It's smooth enough, looks fine. I think another potential downside of this lens is that it's pretty heavy for a zoom lens. Well, that's not true. It's pretty heavy. It's not heavy for a zoom lens. Zoom lenses tend to be heavy anyway. They have a lot of glass in them, and they're a little more complicated than primes. So sometimes I just don't feel like carrying it with me because of that weight, but like I said earlier, it's kind of worth it because it just gives you so many options when you're shooting. Another thing I think worth mentioning is that there's this significant barrel extension here when you're adjusting it. And I understand that it's easier to design the lens that way, and I think probably cheaper, and that was the decision that they made. The only problem with that is those kinds of lenses are prone to suck in dust and dirt and debris. This is feeling pretty smooth right now. I haven't really had a problem. I certainly don't see anything in the optics or anything like that, and I've had this in some pretty dusty and dirty environments. That is a concern over time, you know, as you use a lens like this for 10 years. I think that is one potential risk because it's not really a sealed environment. But I haven't had a problem with it like dumping out or extending on its own, really. It's a very smooth focus experience and zoom experience. So no complaints, really. Just I think some people don't like those kinds of lenses. So another thing is it's pretty robust. I tend to take care of my gear, but I have used this thing extensively, and it has, banged into a few rocks now and then, and it keeps on working. So no complaints in terms of the build quality or anything like that. I'm not going to get into a bunch of details, taking test images of brick walls or anything like that. It's not really my thing. As I said earlier, you can expect a very nice rendition from this lens and fairly sharp as you would from most Fujifilm lenses. F4 is great. I've shot this lens at night a fair amount, so if you have in-body stabilization especially, you get quite a few extra not stops of light, but you get a lot of stabilization so you can slow your shutter speed down, and you can actually do some photography at night with this thing as well, which is pretty incredible for a lens that is this versatile. So yeah, I think overall, in summary, other options to consider if you're looking at this lens would be the 16 to, I think, 55 2.8, which is from Fujifilm. No stabilization in that lens. They're either have already released or will be releasing, I think, like an 18 to 120, something in that range, which could be a real competitor to this if it has stabilization, which I think it will. That's going to give you even more, focal range. Hard to say if it will be as good of a rendition or not. And then I believe Tamron is making a few lenses. I think they have it for Sony now, and it will be for Fujifilm if it's not already out. I think very similar focal range to this, 16 to 80, 70, 50, something like that. So those would be the other options you want to consider if you're looking at these lenses. I've been very happy with this lens. Will I keep it forever? I don't know. I may change it out. At this point, since I have in-body image stabilization, I may go to the 16 to 55 at some point. We'll see. That's about it. Overall, positive review. It's not my favorite lens, but probably one of my most used lenses. So anyway, I think that kind of wraps us up. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Take it easy.